Welcome to another edition of Throwing Out Some Heavy Light. My name is Aljamal Binding. I'm the chair of the Moore Board of Directors. And what we have today in the studio with us is Dr. Pat Velasquez, who is also a board member and also the chair of our Research and Data Committee. Patrick's a longtime person who's been around, and we've done a number of interviews. And so we're going to have a great discussion about a couple of books that he's critiqued in, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. We hope that you we'll have an opportunity to watch this and then maybe get back to us for some feedback, because we're just going to basically record it and put it out there for you. Today's discussion will focus on two books published in 2023 that address the experience of Chicano Latino students in higher education. With us is Dr. Patrick Velasquez, a retired Chicano educator who resides in San Diego, California. He was born and raised in Omaha, and his family is one of the first Chicano families to settle in South Omaha. Dr. Velasquez spent 28 years working as a professor and in student affairs administrator at the University of California in San Diego, which Dr. Velasquez describes as one of the most racist institutions in the United States. I thought Omaha had the most racist, but he said, no, they can beat us there. He also has done research and advocacy that focuses on institutional conditions in colleges and universities, contributing to success and the empowerment of Chicano Latino students. And so we're really happy that he could join us together today with us and talk about these two books. So first start off by asking a question, Dr. Velasquez. Our two books are up for discussion: Transforming Hispanic Serving Institutions for Equity and Justice by Dr. Gina Ann Garcia. And we're also going to talk a little bit about reparations universities, why diversities alone won't solve racism in higher education by Dr. Anna Garcia Stroke, I think. Dr. Velasquez, please give us a brief introduction of both of these books and why they're important to understand what happens in the institutional conditions that we are needed by Chicanos and students in higher education. And I almost want to say for other students of color also, because I think some of the stuff that I've read in their readings is universal. And so even though she speaks primarily to Chicano students, it's like the blanket fits all of the oppressed folks who've dealt with this white supremacy and racism. But give us a little bit more backdrop on the books and let's go into this discussion.
Sure. Well, first of all, it's good to be here again. Good to see you again. And yeah, these are two really timely books. The content is very timely considering some of the things that are happening in education in the United States right now. And the first one you mentioned is this particular book, which is called Transforming Hispanic Serving Institutions for Equity and Justice. And the author is Dr. Gina Ann Garcia. Dr. Garcia has written a couple of other books and numerous articles before. She's probably become the most recognized and often cited Chicano or Chicana scholar of higher education today. And what she really deals with in this book is something that we call Hispanic Serving Institutions, or HSIs. They're a little bit of a parallel with historically black colleges and universities, although there's also some significant differences. But what the principle of HSI means is that if any college or university has a student enrollment, an undergraduate enrollment that's at least 25% Chicano Latino, then they can be considered an HSI. And what that means is that they can be certified as a HSI by the federal government, and then they can be eligible for funding under federal Title III and Title V. So one of the things that Garcia has been saying for years is that there are too many institutions in the United States that are just resting on their laurels, so to speak. So they've reached this level where 25% of their enrollment is Chicano and Latino, but that's all they're doing. They're not doing anything to make the conditions of their college or university more conducive for the success of these Chicano Latino students. And so she talks about the fact that a lot of these institutions maintain a culture, an institutional culture, that really centers on whiteness, or you could say it's a reflection of white supremacy. And so, as you can see in the title of the book, Garcia is calling for institutional transformation, the kind of change in colleges' institutional culture that will decenter whiteness and make these colleges and universities, as you said, not only reflective of Chicano Latino students, but all students of color, and not in just superficial or symbolic ways. Now, if we look at the second book, which is by Ariana Gonzalez Stocas, called Reparative Universities, Why Diversity Alone won't solve racism in higher education. I think this book is a little bit more complex. Gonzalez Stocas is a philosopher, that's her field, whereas Garcia is a scholar of higher education. Gonzalez Stocas is a scholar of philosophy. And so her analysis is really informed by the scholarship in that particular discipline. The main premise of her book is, as the title says, diversity as a concept is really not sufficient to deconstruct institutional racism in higher education. And this is a woman who has worked for years as an administrator in so-called DEI, or diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives. And having done this work and done some research on it, she's arguing that we need to be very critical of those DEI initiatives and that they have not been very effective. About the only thing, for the most part, they've done is to allow administrators, very racist administrations of colleges and universities, to control diversity and to water it down and include groups that are perhaps diverse, you might say, but not really subordinate or occupy subordinate status in the way that people of color are. And the other thing that I think is poignant about Gonzalez Stocas' book is that she calls on these institutions to use reparations as a way to eliminate racism from their institutions. And we're used to now hearing, I think, the term reparations, but we tend to associate it only with financial reparations. So for example, in California, the state legislature here formed a task force to study the possibility of making reparations to African American residents of California. And as I understand, there's a lot of things that they talked about and a lot of solutions, but sometimes what the media focuses on is just financial remuneration. And as Gonzalez Stoca says, there's a lot more to it than that.
You know, just before we switch up, one quick question. How did you discover both books? Because they're fascinating books, and the average layperson or academician would not run into two individuals. But what made you find these two books, or how did they come to your attention? Because I find them, when I was read through them, I was like, wow, this is like a manifesto that can help the DEI program. By the way, I call DEI just destructive, elimination, and irritation. That's what it really stands for, because at the end of the day, it does nothing to help us. But how did you discover, Patrick, both those books?
Well, the book by Garcia came to my attention. A colleague told me about that. But again, I'm familiar with her work, and I've even had some email contact with her. She's a very down-to-earth scholar.
Okay.
She also has a podcast, and I also found out about the book by listening to her podcast on higher education. The other one was just accidental, man. I was looking at a website that had a number of books about equity in higher education. I was actually looking for something else, but I saw the title of this one, and it really intrigued me. So I checked it out and read it, and it was really provocative.
Wow, I'm impressed. Matter of fact, I think it should be required reading for anybody who works in multicultural education, who works at post-secondary institutions, whether it be community colleges or universities or postdoc, you name it, because it shows you how corrupt the whole university oppressive white supremacy system is. I'm going to switch up and ask you a different question. In her book, Dr. Garcia uses the term servingness, and that's an unusual term, servingness, to describe how colleges and universities must transform to best serve Chicanos and other underrepresented students of color. What does it mean by that term, servingness? That's a different one for some of us.
Yeah, I think it's really a term that she has coined herself. And again, it has to deal with the fact that these institutions we're talking about are referred to as Hispanic serving institutions.
Okay.
So they're not called, at least by the federal government, they're not called Hispanic enrolling institutions. She's trying to say, yeah, that's great, man. You get to the point where 25% of your students are Latino, but what are you doing to help them succeed? Where's your institutional focus and priority? And so she uses this term servingness to try to conceptually think about what these institutions should look like if they're really sincere about trying to maximize the success of their Chicano Latino students. And one of the things that she talks about is, if you want to serve these students effectively, you better know who they are. You better understand their needs. And in a sense, that almost starts with the recognition of their historic oppression as Chicanos Latinos and the subsequent current subordination as a community of color that Chicano Latinos continue to face. She also talks about the fact that the current model of higher education in the United States is one that reflects colonialism. In other words, white supremacy and Eurocentrism. And to a large extent, I think Gonzalez Toca says much the same thing that colleges and universities need to focus very explicitly on students of color. And so if you're an HSI, your mission statement, your strategic plan should specifically talk about that and talk about the history and the current conditions and needs of those Chicano Latino students as a way to at least begin think about building servingness on your campus.
I noticed that Garcia also talks about liberatory outcomes, which is a kind of an unusual term. And first thing I think of is Paul Fair when I see those type of terms as a focus of colleges and universities that serve Chicano students. What are such outcomes, and why does Garcia believe they are important in terms of that concept, liberatory outcomes?
Yeah, I think that for a lot of folks and a lot of Chicanos in higher education, these are things that we've always pursued, but maybe we didn't call on that, or we didn't have a term for them, or we didn't talk about them explicitly. So she differentiates these liberatory outcomes from so-called academic outcomes or traditional outcomes, we might say. So usually when people talk about, okay, how do we want Chicano students to succeed, or what would be some indicators of Chicano, Black, Native American student success? And people will say, well, it's their first year retention rates, or it might be their retention from first to second year. It might be their graduation rates, their GPAs when they graduate, etc. And so these are these traditional academic outcomes. And Garcia says these are great, but she also refers to them as white normative outcomes. And she makes a distinction between them and these liberatory outcomes, which are things like students building an ethnic identity, knowing who they are, and what it means to be part of an ethnic community that has a subordinate status in the United States racial hierarchy. So ethnic identity is a liberatory outcome. The development of a social consciousness is also one of those outcomes. Having an anti-racist orientation and a commitment to social justice. Those are just some of the liberatory outcomes that are identified by Garcia. And again, I think when I think about progressive people in the Chicano community, these are things that we've always wanted our students to acquire when they go to college and university. We don't want the students to go to higher education and become assimilated. And if they get these kind of knowledge bases and sensibilities, they will be better prepared to be socially conscious leaders, to come back to our communities and create positive change in those communities. And again, I want to emphasize that Garcia does place a high value on these traditional outcomes, but that the liberatory outcomes are equally important. And she also talks extensively about, again, as a part of serving this, how do we reach these liberatory outcomes? And she really documents the scholarly research showing that support for students, academic and personal support, transformational mentoring, racial and ethnic validation, diverse curriculum, all these kinds of variables in colleges and universities, they tend to enhance and contribute to liberatory outcomes.
You know, when you use that term, and again, transforming. So, what does transforming HSI look like according to Garcia, in a sense? In other words, give me a little bit more specifics on that. And again, we're talking a little bit like a cookbook approach, if I'm hearing you well.
Yeah, I think so. And again, it's not surprising. I think when Ajamal, when you and I were in graduate school in our master's program, you know, some of the good professors, the intelligent professors, there weren't too many of them, but the ones that were there, you know, they used to talk about the difference between educational reform and educational transformation. So reforms might be things like little programs that help students succeed, and those are valuable, man. But what transformed HSIs look like, in a sense, it's a lot of the things again that activists, Chicanos, African Americans, Native Americans have been demanding for decades now. So a transformed HSI features Chicano leadership
Hmm.
and socially conscious leadership, something we don't see very often. It also includes a representative level of Chicano faculty. One of the things that we look at here in California is we have a number of institutions where the student body is anywhere between 25 and maybe 40% Latino, but the full-time or tenure track faculty are only maybe 10, 15% Latino. So there needs to be more parity there. Garcia talks about terms like racial equity, social justice, liberation, that those are part of the things that you see in a transformed HSI. And again, it contributes to liberatory outcomes. It recognizes and validates the lived experiences that our students bring to a college or a university. And if you can imagine this, she says it provides an environment at the college or university that's actually free of racism. And again, all that helps to prepare our students to be socially conscious leaders and change agents. And another interesting term that Garcia uses is she says that when an HSI is transformed, it de-credentials whiteness. So she talks about whiteness and being white as a form of credential. And so this moves the credentialing or the power off of whiteness and redistributes this power more equitably so that people of color actually participate equitably,
Hmm.
right, in distributing resources and making decisions. And then one final note about these transformed HSIs is Garcia makes an important point that the institutions that are the farthest away from one of these transformed HSIs are the most selective universities. So we've been hearing a lot about Harvard University, but even in public universities like UC San Diego, where I worked for 28 years, these institutions have the most white centered decision making structures with very little or no authentic Chicano leadership. And again, they're the most in need of transformation.
You know, as you were talking, it came to mind not only your experience, and again, the next question after you comes up to an example. How has University of San Diego responded to the recommendation of Dr. Garcia to better serve the increasing large Chicano student body? And again, based on your own experience working in those systems, how have you thought of that from your own vantage point, as well as from her recommendation she has in her book? How do you commingle or talk about your experience as a person who works in post-secondary education, and of course, what she recommends? I assume there's some similarities there.
Yeah, I started at UC San Diego, which is part of the 9 campus University of California system. Again, it's the quote unquote highest level of public post secondary institution in California. Um, I was there from 1989 to 2017, and from what I can see, it hasn't changed at all since then. And in terms of the question, how have they responded to calls like this to transform themselves to better serve Chicano students? They simply have not. And they have not shown the institutional will or the value to want to become a transformed HSI. There, amongst there's let me say, I guess there's 11 public institutions of higher education in San Diego County. So we have 3 4-year universities and we have 8 community colleges in San Diego. All of them have become an HSI. They've
Mm,
all reached that level of at least
wow.
55% enrollment, except for UC San Diego, the most selective of all the institutions that we have in our city and county. They have no Chicano leadership. They have no Chicano studies department. Less than 10% of their tenure track faculty are Chicano. And they don't have any well funded programs that support Chicano students and help them develop liberatory outcomes.
Hmm.
So we have to ask ourselves, how does this happen? Like, how do these racist institutions maintain such conditions? And another thing that Garcia talks about is the importance of our elected officials.
Hmm.
In the case of California, we have a state assembly and a state senate, and these elected officials provide funding, state funding for the University of California.
Hmm.
And as such, they really have to hold them accountable. As I said, Garcia really talks about the role, the important role that elected officials play in institutional transformation. Unfortunately, in California, the track record of Latino legislators in the area of higher education is very poor. Most of them have been too cowardly to enact any real change, and
Hmm.
that's a real misfortune for our students.
Hmm. We know that even in states like California, whites hold most of the leadership positions in higher education. Also, you talk in terms of the numbers of Latinos in the state as a whole. What are the implications for this, and are there likely to be any major changes that Garcia suggests for this transformation based on your reading the tea leaves or your experience of living in that area?
Yeah, I would say as long as whites maintain most of the leadership in California higher education, we're not likely to see these kinds of changes. There are some shifts, but again, the real challenge is to get not just Chicano leaders, but socially conscious
Hmm.
Chicano. And when I look at all the white leadership in higher education positions, they're almost like looters during a riot. When you see a riot break out historically, and there are people looting, breaking into stores and stealing furniture and televisions and so forth, that's what it seems like, right? Because while Chicano students are struggling, our students are struggling in the worst kind of racist environments in colleges and universities. These white leaders are making huge amounts of money, big salaries, and they're also preserving white privilege, which is their main priority. Again, it's clear from the research of Garcia that Chicano leadership is critical. It's unlikely that these changes are going to be made in higher education when we talk about real, authentic transformation. And we need socially conscious Chicanos in all levels of leadership. And when you look at some of these colleges and universities, particularly some of the academic leadership positions, like the deans of divisions, academic divisions, so academic deans, department chairs, provosts, etc., academic vice chancellors or vice presidents. Um, Finding Chicanos in these positions is very rare. And again, as Garcia says, we also need them on the boards of governors or the boards of trustees that oversee these large systems of higher education. So there's a board of trustees for the University of California system, the California State system of universities, which has, I believe, 23 campuses, and they have a board of trustees as well. And again, very rare to see Chicano, socially conscious Chicanos in particular, that serve on these boards.
Hmm. Yeah, it seems like you guys say there's a grasp of the progressive scholarship in higher education, what's going on. And my point is that so?
Yeah, I think Garcia's grasp is really profound, because the way that she weaves in different threads of scholarship. So she's, I believe she has a background in organizational theory.
Okay.
She brings in the scholarship on transformational leadership in higher education, and that's a large body of scholarship.
Hmm.
She also brings into her analysis the theoretical frameworks in critical race theory.
Hmm.
And as we know, that's become, at least among racist whites, a very controversial area. I think because it is profound, because it does have a lot of important directions. And then she also weaves in the strand of scholarship that deals with critical pedagogy and the kind of classroom instruction and dynamics that are most effective in helping Chicano students to learn.
Hmm. By the way, Patrick, as you alluded to critical race theories, what I'm so much shocked and amazed with is the number of academicians of color, both Latinos, Chicanos, African Americans, Asians, Native Americans, who quiet as church mouse. When you hear the governor of Florida and these local institutions use that as a straw man, and they are, for the most part, who work in those systems, they're scared of their jobs and they won't push back, nor will they align with people in the community who have the position to push back. And it's just amazing how that right-wing, racist, neo-fascist, kind of Confederate type Southerner Bell people are getting away with stuff. They're getting away with banning books and trying to push it back to the Stone Age. And we know that this country oppressed and subjugated people of color. And so even in Nebraska, you got the Jewish community have gotten the Holocaust studies in, but they won't talk about slavery or even genocide against Native Americans or even the deportations of Chicanos back in the day. So it's kind of strange that you know who your friends are. And again, when you have Black studies or Latino studies and the people who have some of the most education, even tenure, are quiet and scared of their own jobs, what good are they? You follow me?
Yeah, I mean, I hope that in Florida that people are meeting and marshaling their resources, putting their heads together, and planning some kind of strategy. I want to assume that they are. If you look at what happened in Tucson, Arizona, when very right racist whites tried to outlaw the curriculum of Chicano studies in the Arizona public schools, excuse me, the Tucson Unified Public Schools, the Chicanos took to the streets and they protested actively, but they also filed suit and eventually won.
Mm-hmm.
What they're doing in Florida now to outlaw the instruction of critical race theory, particularly at the level of higher education, is absolutely absurd, and that has to be fought at all levels.
Mm-hmm. By the way, Dr. Garcia, Gina Garcia books have some profound recommendations for higher education. How does Gonzalez Stroke's book complement those recommendations? Because we talked a little about both books here, but give me a little bit more feedback on that one.
Yeah, to say a little bit more now about the book by Gonzalez Stocas, her emphasis is on the role of colleges and universities and how they really act to socialize young people, that they act as agents of socialization. And in that sense, they justify the racist capitalist form of exploitation in the United States. Um, the author really believes in the importance of the historic context to understand systemic racism and institutional racism, and particularly the role that higher education plays in maintaining that kind of racism. She talks about white supremacy that's also justified and reinforced by colleges and universities, and states unequivocally that these colleges and universities have to be decolonized. And I like the way she talks about that. She says that this kind of decolonization at the institutional level, that it's really a struggle to have the right to determine who participates in higher education and what are the criteria for determining who can participate. So we're talking as a country now in terms of affirmative action about admissions, right? Who gets into the college or university, and who has the right to determine the criteria. And she says this is important, man. This is where the battle really is. It's not in the struggle for inclusion under existing criteria, that we shouldn't just be looking and accepting the existing criteria, whether it's hiring faculty or admitting students. We need to really question, how do we get the power to determine the criteria?
Mm-hmm.
And again, as I mentioned, Gonzalez Stocas is very critical of these DEI initiatives and says that they were never really formulated
Mm-hmm.
or conceptualized to eliminate racism in higher education. What she talks about instead is the concept of reparations, and that's what's really needed to make these higher education institutions non-racist. And so when we get more deeply into that, she talks about how, if we ask the question, how do these universities validate what they consider to be real knowledge?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Why is it that white history, white literature, white music, white art, everything white is legitimated as a subject of study?
Right.
That's all considered authentic knowledge and valid knowledge, but all the knowledge constructed by people of color and that we value is not considered valid.
Mm-hmm.
Not to get all technical also, but Gonzalez Stocas talks about something we would call epistemology, or how knowledge is constructed. And I've seen some of this in the literature of some scholars of color, where they do their research based on people's experience, and the idea that for people of color, this is one of the tenets, as I understand, of critical race theory, that personal experience is a valid form of knowledge.
Hmm.
And so when we talk about the authentic experiences of people of color, that's part of what valid knowledge is. It's
Hmm.
not just theory and quantitative research. But again, Gonzalez Tocas argues that in order to make these kind of what we might call radical changes, we have to have power. We have to have the power to make policy. And
Hmm.
I think this is really where the two authors we're talking about today are on the same page. Is a much greater need than before for power.
Hmm. As you said, the thought came to mind is that most of our universities and colleges rarely bring in the elders of our community or the people who are the vanguards in the struggle. And even the ones they bring in sometime are the ones that have been pacified, or the ones who they like, who are the same old people, versus those who are the ones who are what we call destructive in terms of constructive destructive, or the destructive of the racism or the negativity that destroys the culture of a group. And they tend to bring in these kind of formal OPS type teachers to teach classes, and music teachers who have no sense of substance and so on. And again, you get a chair of the Black Studies who's known more for drill team marching than marching in the streets to deal with the racism at the police department. Or you got these people who become so codified in the system. I know when I read her book, she talked a great deal about how we have to reinvent the whole world and way that we do knowledge for our communities, instead of have them impose their brainwashing crap on us and making us nothing but sheep in terms of our own issues. So therefore, when you look at our community, some of the greatest ideals have been taken away because they get co-opted, scholars, and we don't have any use to help clean up some of the cesspools, and then they run with their same old draw play and build more prisons and jails and say, again, we'll give scholarships. For example, down in Texas, I met a person at a conference one time who told she had her whole 4-year or 2-year graduate education, whatever, paid for by the prison system in Texas, because they were looking for people to work in there to keep hurting those people there. I want to switch back on. We've been talking recently, society, about this whole recent affirmative action thing, and the Supreme Court just came out and they went against the president and basically said that you can have a student body and you can have a student faculty and curriculum, and their compelling interests for some universities, kind of a mixed bag in how they ruled on that. And this is not the first time that they ruled in kind of a mixed bag, even back in the Blocky case that happened years ago in California. But how does Gonzalez Stokes' book confirm, but also challenge the notion of the importance of diversity? Because again, a lot of us don't have a notion of what that real diversity means. And from your vantage point, looking at the book, what does that really mean according to what the Supreme Court has just done?
Yeah, I think Gonzalez Tocas does a good job of analyzing that, because it used to be, I think, Ajamal, when you and I were in graduate school, that it was 1978 when Bakke versus California was ruled by the United States Supreme Court, and it said that racial quotas, are illegal. But if a university wanted to, they could consider race as one variable in admission, because the rationale being that if you have a diverse student body, that provides a richer educational environment for all students. And one of the impressive things I think about the scholarship in higher education is that many scholars of color, along with some white allies, they realized that racist people were going to keep coming after affirmative action.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Just like these racists that filed this case really under false pretenses in the most recent ruling. And so that they probably, the scholars of higher education probably spent the next 30 or 40 years after Bakke doing research on the benefits of diversity for students. And again, how it does make the learning environment richer for all students. So they did a really good job of documenting that. And this idea of having a rich, diverse student body is especially compelling when you think about the way that the demographics in the United States are changing.
mm-hmm.
When I started teaching at UC San Diego in 1989, I used to tell my students that 3/4 of the United States population was white. And by the time I retired 28 years later, I was saying that more like 60 to 65% were white instead of 75%. It's not going to be that long before less than 50% of the people in this country are white, and if assuming the Earth still exists. So when you consider that compelling interest, it's important. But again, Gonzalez Stocas' analysis is that institutions use this research to make diversity into something for which it was not intended. And for these racist institutional leaders, it became a way for them to actually, as she puts it, to police diversity and to use diversity in a way that makes them feel comfortable and can help them to control people of color. So again, they're saying, yeah, if you're black, you're Chicano, Native American, you can come into college, you can come into the university as a student or as a faculty member, but you're going to do it on our terms according to our criteria, and we will be the ones to determine the criteria for how people can participate. And one of the things that happened with that, with this whole diversity and inclusion principle, is that now you start to have groups that do not face systemic oppression and the material deprivation that comes with being systemically oppressed.
Mhm.
So now we have Jewish folks, LGBTQ folks, folks with disabilities, and all of these communities, they do face some barriers or prejudices. But these are not communities that are the subjects of systemic oppression. Most women in the United States, most Jews, most people with disabilities, most LGBTQ people are white. And as such, they enjoy the unearned privileges of whiteness. So colleges and universities can claim that they value diversity. They can usually point to some symbolic diversity initiatives, but very seldom do they make the kind of profound reparations that really amounts to sharing power equitably with people of color. And the other thing about all these diversity initiatives, according to Gonzalez Stocas, is that they've been largely ineffective. They've been in place for decades now, and yet most of the power still rests with whites. Whites are still in all these positions as academic deans, provosts, academic vice presidents, etc. And so they wield most of the power. As such, the curriculum and the pedagogy are white.
Mhm.
So what Gonzalez Stocas points out is if you look at most diversity initiatives, they tend to be things like workshops or faculty staff affinity groups. You and I recently had a conversation with some officials from UNO, and that's what they talked about in terms of diversity: workshops and affinity groups. And these things do not challenge power. They don't make changes in the policies and practices or the structures that perpetuate oppression.
Mhm. Come and think of that meeting we were in, and I find it somewhat comical when we think about it, is that it was like we were talking to people who wasn't serious, or they have never had external people of color challenge them. And then obviously, the guy who looked like Willie Nelson, I'm not gonna make fun of him or nothing, but he actually had the nerve to say, who has no history in the state of Nebraska, he's from out of town, he has no track record, and he's got this audacity to challenge me and say, hey, the fact that we brought you to this table, you should be grateful, like I'm on some plantation and I'm happy to be in the master's house. I'm like, hey, you just got off the plane, man. So don't talk to me like that in a sense. And then again, you see now the city of Omaha hired a white female to be the head of the human relations department. I mean, you ask yourself, what kind of crack are these people smoking? If you can't even get a black person or a Hispanic or Native American or Asian in your traditional token positions, because you don't put any other positions hardly at the university. And again, if you look at the people who applied for that job, they bring somebody in who they can control. He has a different orientation. So what? I mean, how does sexuality, in a sense, become the same latitude as they say racial, that historical oppression that has happened through generations? And we have to have that conversation. But you have a white male who practices a different kind of sexual behavior, and he's treated like he's a minority. Give me a break. That's part of the arrogance of racism. And so again, the same thing that happens with the women's situation. You live with the oppressor, you get the same income, and somebody who's been historically denied opportunities, we can't even get inside the room, but yet we got to pay taxes to these racist, fascist, public serving institution. It's sad. But I want to come back to something different, Pat, if I can. And again, considering the Supreme Court ruling, which is going to be one of the biggest challenges that we face with the kind of dealing with the changes that they're recommending with Garcia and, of course, Stokes. And Garcia, how are we going to deal with that? How are we going to deal with that, considering that there's some of us who are saying, hey, the sky is falling? How do you come and make sense of that with the politics that we're having, with even in campaign that people are starting to run for president? How are we going to deal with all these issues?
Yeah, I think we have to come to terms with it and to be explicit and honest about analyzing it and what it is, what the challenges are that we face. When you look at the Supreme Court decision to outlaw affirmative action, to actually make affirmative action illegal, to say that it's a violation of the United States Constitution. And then you look at some of the things that Chief Justice Roberts said in his opinion. What's really happening is in a sense, you could say Roberts is speaking for, I'm going to use the term, the white community in the United States, white folks across the United States, in saying that we don't think racism exists. Maybe it never did, but it doesn't exist now, and it doesn't affect the lives of people of color. That Chicanos like me or African Americans like Ajamal, that they're free to go about life and enjoy all the privileges without being fettered by or affected by racism.
Mm-hmm.
So that's maybe one of the biggest challenges we face, I think, is to make white people, and particularly those in power like Joe Biden, understand that systemic racism was a reality and it continues to be a reality, and that racism continues to structure opportunities for people of color.
Mm-hmm.
The people like the Supreme Court or another white spokesperson like Ron DeSantis, who's trying to eliminate, as we said, trying to eliminate the teaching of critical race theory at all levels under the false rationale that racism doesn't exist. Or I even saw this really sad, shameless Uncle Tom, Tim Scott, that's running for president, has the nerve to run for president. He got up and said, I don't think the United States is a racist society. So, we've got to create more awareness, or at least let people know that we don't swallow that, we don't
Mm-hmm.
buy that we're maybe at a different intellectual level, but I understand it is very difficult for white folks to admit that racism exists, because if you think about it, as soon as they admit that racism exists, they're also admitting that people of color are harmed by racism.
Mm-hmm.
And if we are harmed by racism, then somebody must benefit by racism.
Right.
And that's the tough one, that is white people don't want to acknowledge that they enjoy the benefits of white privilege, regardless of their religion, their income, their disability, etc. So, Ajma, one of the things that I've been hearing in the media under this discussion of affirmative actions elimination is this idea that elections have consequences.
Mm-hmm.
Elections have consequences. If the country elects a racist like Donald Trump, you end up with the kind of corrupt, incompetent people we have on the Supreme Court, like Roberts and Alito, Clarence Thomas, etc. So somehow we've got to have a better alternative, certainly, than Donald Trump. But the real challenge, I think, is down the road.
Mm-hmm.
We need to have a better alternative than Joe Biden as well. And as long as we're stuck in this rat race, or this trap of choosing between people like Donald Trump and Joe Biden, then we are not advancing as communities of color. And so not only the presidential level, of course, but we've also got to acquire and develop the power to elect state representatives that force colleges and universities to be accountable and to provide power to people of color.
Mm-hmm. Pat, we're getting close to the end, but there's about 2 or 3 questions I still want to kind of do what we call an audible and ask you. The book, I guess in the book, Garcia Stroke, she in her book, Why Diversity Alone Won't Solve Race and Higher Education, she quotes Robin D.G. Kelly, Black Studies, Black Struggles, which is kind of a landmark study that talks about how you deconstruct this whole post-secondary education. And I find it fascinating that she used his study, and other people quote him because he basically came out of the woodworks and just dealt with that. But my question specifically for you is that how was you able to maintain a sense of sobriety as well as sanity inside of a system, or the octopus, as Matthew Shelley used to call institutions that were racist and so on? But how did you survive? Because I know it's not easy, particularly for that many years. But what kept you going? Was it religion? Was it peyote? What was it that made you survive that kind of torturous experience that I'm seeing in these books that most Hispanics or Chicanos go through?
I think it was a combination of factors. I would have to say that my mother, in paz descanse, as we say, and may she rest in peace, my mother, and I knew your mother, Jamal, and I would say the same thing about her, man, that they they helped us to develop as people with values.
Mm,
That we had positive values. We had, I was raised with principles of unselfishness
mm-hmm,
and of commitment and of not accepting injustice. And I think also from there, I was lucky also to have some very powerful mentors. When I
mm-hmm,
was young, that I had mentors that showed me that the worse, most oppressive situation you deal with, the more you've got to fight back.
mm-hmm,
You can't
mm-hmm,
allow yourself to be pushed around. And then I think I was lucky to get mentors even in graduate school that showed me
mm-hmm,
an example of what a scholar activist is. That
mm-hmm,
you
mm-hmm.
have to give up being an activist if you want to become a scholar as well. So I think I had a lot of support. One thing that helped me a lot at UC San Diego was the support of students.
Mm-hmm.
So what I found is that students are very perceptive. They can usually tell which people of color are for real and which ones are down, which ones are really dedicated and committed, as opposed to those that are sellouts.
Mm-hmm.
So I always found the students of color that I worked with, they were very appreciative, man. They always understood what myself and other people were trying to do to provide them support in direction and mentoring and so forth. And they always appreciated that. They always had my back as well. And that's for sure. I would have never survived at UCSD without the support of the students.
Hmm. Also, in one of the books, one of the authors, and I confuse that because they both have some themes and similarity. They use the word abolitionists, just get rid of it. Again, some of us know about abolitionists work towards getting rid of slavery. Abolitionists work get rid of the police department and so on, where they literally call out institutions and people and say they're totally useless and worthless. And on a personal level, Patrick, I want to ask you is, how do you know when to call out a teal talker or a bootlicking Uncle Tom or somebody who's selling the community out as a colleague who could be Hispanic or be an African American, whatever? But have you done that, or do you do that? Or what is your vantage point on people who are helping to serve the master's need, as Bell Hooks and obviously Audre Lorde talks about? We can't use the master's tools to destroy his house. So how do you deal with calling out or calling in on someone who has the same complexion or as a person of color as you? How do you do that, or do you do any of that?
Yeah, I feel like I will do it, and I have done it when I think the situation calls for it. And it's a good question. I think it requires some thought and some consideration. You have to discern. Um, I always understood that there were a certain number of Chicanos that were struggling to get into the profession of higher education that perhaps could have done more and been more vocal to support our community. But I understand that some folks, it's a really difficult thing for them to do. And I also feel like over the years, I always continue to develop a greater understanding of colonialism
Mm-hmm.
and the effects of colonialism and how colonialism makes us, as colonized people in the United States, doubt ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
doubt our ability to create change, or to even become scared of what change would look like, even if it's positive change.
Mm-hmm.
So in some cases, I think in most cases, I would say I gave the benefit of the doubt to my Chicano colleagues that were not vocal. Some of them were trying to create positive change in a much more quiet way than I was, or they were trying to do it behind the scenes. But where I did make the exception was when I saw Chicanos or African Americans or Native Americans that were clearly selling out the interests of our communities in an effort to advance themselves professionally.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, you better believe I saw some people of color over 28 years at UC San Diego that were consciously selling out, that were comfortable with selling out the interests of our own communities in order to become more advanced in the professional hierarchy.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I saw this mentality among some of them where they lied to themselves, and thought that they could continue to advance to a higher professional level. And at some point, they would have more power and could really do something that amounted to change. But when I saw people like that they were consciously selling out our interest, then I didn't hesitate to label them for what I saw.
Mhm.
I
The
think,
reason I say that is because I've written letters to the superintendent of the public schools who's now got her money and left town, and gratuity or whatever, retirement pay, stayed there for 5 years, got vested and left quickly. Black person, first black superintendent, female, and basically was totally useless and had no real connections with our black community. They brought these token in carpetbagger Negroes and so on. We had a person who came in from the chamber. They brought her in, first time black woman in the history to be the Chamber of Commerce in Omaha. Some people liked it, but they chased her out after 9 months. I wrote a letter, both these individuals, and never responded to the letters. Again, you just basically trying to say, hey, welcome to Omaha. How can you meet with the community? Right now, we just had Department of Helpless and Hopeless Service African-American, second African-American female in recent years. She just resigned. Again, I can't think of any construction she did helping low-income people who are in the system that. And so it's been crazy and so on. But the last question I want to ask you, and I guess it's a question that people ask us as practitioners, as scholars, as advocates, and so on. How do we measure success? In other words, what is the magic wand that would make you or make us happy as a person of color that we know our systems and institutions are successful in serving our needs? So give me some examples of that from your vantage point.
yeah, I think that there are indicators of success in the institutions, and some of them are very tangible. Again, when you see the numbers of Chicano students, for example, in an institution begin to get higher and higher, then you know that that's a positive factor. When you see socially conscious Chicanos hired as faculty and as administrators, and you see the work that they're doing, then you know that's you've had some positive influence on that. And so we can tell, I think, that the changes in higher education institutions are visible enough that we can usually be guided by those indicators. And I would add, though, that this is a battle, man. This is a struggle for power, and we have to keep throwing punches. We have to keep fighting.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes, even if you don't see indications that you're making progress, you have to keep fighting anyway, because at times the fight itself is the point.
Right.
That again, that when you let the colonizer think that you will not fight back, then you've surrendered for all practical purposes and you've made their job easier. And so that's something we absolutely can't accept. And so I think we should always be strategic in our objectives. We should always have a plan. And again, we should be able to document the indicators of success that we've achieved.
Mm-hmm.
The important thing is to keep up the struggle and again to be informed by the direction we're going. This is where this scholarship we're talking about today is so important. That it's not just intellectual food for thought. That we need to know the direction toward which we are pushing these institutions. And when we talk to elected officials, we need to be able to say, this is what you should be doing, this is what we all should be doing, and this is why we know it's effective, because it's grounded, man. It's informed by the scholarship. So I think as long as we keep pursuing all those directions, and we're on the right path.
Patrick, I really appreciate you saying that because I vacillate or I sometimes are in a crossroads with the same concept of how when you call somebody out, how do you deal with it with success? And back in the day, you don't know this, but I used to go to the UNO bookstore and every semester see what books they were prescribing deal with race and issues of racism and so on. And I stopped doing it because the caliber of the people they're bringing in are for the most part, sellouts, Uncle Toms, or even have people who don't even live in Nebraska teaching courses in Black studies and have no sense of reciprocity, even returning phone calls or anything, because again, they just take the money and run. But what I find unfortunate is that when I look at the conditions of our respective communities and I see things getting worse, and I don't see any scholars or people who we sent to post-secondary education come back and help us, but yet they go and they turn on us, then I sometimes lose hope. And I even say, let's get rid of Black studies or Chicano studies, even the education department, because at the end of the day, if our kids, the indicators are getting worse, the disparities are getting greater, then what are we sitting around here celebrating doing Juneteenth marches or Cinco de Mayo events when we've got significant number of our community in pain and suffering, and the rich keep getting richer? So I really appreciate you coming on today, sharing with us some stuff. And these books are excellent books, and hopefully get some feedback and do some more things in the future. But it's always a pleasure to have you come back and share stuff, because you and I both learned how to be pit bulls in graduate schools, kicking that racist teacher we had, and he had to capitulate and let us do some stuff related to race. So it's always a pleasure to do it. But hopefully we'll get a chance to do another program down the road. So thank you very much.
My pleasure, man. Thanks.
Good. We hope you've enjoyed this edition of Throwing Down Some Heavy Light. This will be posted on our website, and join us again for another edition. Barocco.